Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
It's that time of year for the annual edition of Delmarva Review. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. This year is the 16th annual edition with works of fiction and nonfiction as well as poetry that ranges from grief and death to love and freedom. In our studio this afternoon is executive editor Wilson Wyatt, poetry editor Ann Caldwell, senior fictional editor Harold Wilson, and fictional co-editor Lee Slater. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Wilson, I want to start with you. You got an idea about everything that went into this book, right? What struck you about the nature of this book, particularly as it, say, contrasts from maybe previous years?
Well, we tried to make this a smaller book, and we're unsuccessful. It's almost 400 pages, and it's the quality of the writing that came in was really quite good. We published the works of 72 authors after reading thousands of submissions, and I have to tip my hat off to our editors for having not only the endurance but the ability to see what rises to the top of all the pieces that were submitted. At the end, we selected 70 poems, 12 short stories, and 14 essays. The essays were mainly personal essays or memoir. In all, the writers came from 23 states and the District of Columbia and 4 foreign countries. The review encourages the best new work from authors everywhere. I might mention that in general, about half of the writers come from the Eastern Shore, and the Mid-Atlantic region around the Chesapeake. So that's the background.
In terms, by the way, one of the elements, it seems new to me, perhaps, is this whole concept of flash fiction, flash nonfiction. Talk a little bit about that first, and then we'll go to Harold.
Well, flash fiction seems to be happily becoming more popular, and I think that's because we're all thinking in shorter terms today. We read things shorter and we respond, and but the interesting aspect of that is that flash fiction and flash nonfiction, short prose under 1,000 words, can be, first of all, it can be read in a matter of a couple of minutes, and for attention spans that are short. But it's also concentrated writing like poetry is. And so you think you're reading something short, but all of a sudden it grabs hold of you. And it has several meanings. And it has, all of a sudden you're opening up to several stories, all in one very short piece. So it's challenging. Good flash fiction is challenging, and good short nonfiction or memoir is challenging, just like poetry is.
Harold, I want to turn to you because you're in charge of fiction. Tell me a little bit about the Gold Digger, and what struck me about this story was not only the style of writing and so on, but the fact that it really sort of got to the essence of this, what seems to be a very tragic story, I think, in the end.
I'm not sure it's such a tragic story, Don. Actually, there is a literary level that I look for when I'm reviewing the fiction for the Delmarva Review, and I want to see how the author captures and expresses the fundamental contradictions that characterize human existence. The contradictions, I hope to find these contradictions expressing themselves in a sense of separation, powerlessness, and lostness, for example, that are engaged through love, hate, tenderness, fear, and so forth. The stuff of literature, frankly. And For me, it's important that the engagement of the contradictions are revealed through self-reflection and awareness expressed by the characters, and I also like to see a sense of inevitability in the story that pulls us forward to some startling conclusion, perhaps that also finally leads to a new beginning, or not. It is not necessarily that happens. So I believe that Petrick's story, the short little story, reflects these contradictions and how these two unnamed characters respond to those contradictions. Let me do a quick review. In this little short thing, Gold Digger, that illustrates, I believe, what I'm saying. It's recommended in the story that a woman meet with a famous football player. I have a feeling you two need each other, she says. Okay, the two meet for drinks, then for dinner, and it's all rom-com talk, and each of them jockeying for some kind of position here. But the woman, who is unnamed, and the man unnamed as well, has an agenda. And he might have an agenda too, but we don't know that. Her agenda is to edge into his money and his life, stay with this thing, she says, for a while or until she gets bored, then move on after getting a baby and a settlement. Then she asks a crucial question. Let's listen to this question, and I've asked Lee Slater, because this is a woman's voice in this story, to read this short little section.
Are you bored yet? He asked with a charming smirk. You'll know when I am. On like that, as you both peeled shrimp and slurped oysters. I bought the GQ with your fashion spread, you confess, and taped the cover in my locker. This faux rom-com banter passing for conversation and wit. I always win, he said. And you said, but I never lose. You could do this in your sleep, and surely so could he. Finally, you said, tell me one thing I wouldn't know unless you told me. One thing not found off a Google search. Did you do a Google search? Well, didn't you? Nah, he said. Sometimes I like to let what's going to happen, happen. Even if I'm an axe murderer, you say. That doesn't scare me, he said. Then what does scare you? You asked. Questions like that, he said. You shrugged. I don't have to ask them. Well, I didn't say stop, he said. I said they scare me. What scares you? You paused. People rarely turn questions backward. People like talking about themselves. You rely on that.
Wait a minute. We already know what happens in this story. We found out in the opening paragraph of the story. We know his greatest fear already has been realized. And she says this could lead to something, a beginning, or maybe an ending. We don't know.
Because one of the things that struck me, and I mentioned about the concept of tragedy, is that there is this sense at the end that things did not work as they certainly had envisioned it, and that they seemed to be at this low point in their lives, that suddenly the mundane had sort of seeped into their lives to the point where they were no longer the special people that they once were when they met. I mean, I think that's the thing that struck me about the concept of the tragedy about it.
Well, she changed. clearly, significantly in this story. She discovered something about herself with him. And he is afraid that he will, in a sense, cease to be after football is over. And that's exactly what happens to him. He is, in a sense, no more. And so the tragedy here that you pointed out earlier is clearly that he ceased to be anything to himself. He stumbles from pills to drink to the lounger, and that's who he is now after being this great football player. She is wondering where she goes next and what happens with her. And we don't know. We just don't know where she's going to go.
The other story that struck me was the grandfather's story, Richard Sensenbrenner. And the reason why it seems sort of relevant now is because obviously we have really actually two wars, one in Ukraine and obviously the other one in the Gaza Strip. That is people running back and forth of armies and so on. Tell me a little bit about that and the significance of the story, because it just is sort of this senselessness of conflict.
So Grandfather's story is fascinating because it's an allegory. Across all of the works of fiction that we have in this collection, you'll find such variation like allegory to experimental fiction, a little bit of sci-fi, and yet they're all delightful. They all use these really clever plays of language to give us insight into our own lives, and Grandfather's story certainly does that because of this charged time that we're experiencing. It's really brief, although I wouldn't call it flash fiction, but it does have the quality of parable. It's about wave after wave of senseless destruction and power over other people's identities that all wars carry with them. And so the main character is a grandfather, and he reads from his root cellar letters that people are receiving from their family members who are combatants. And so he's hiding in this root cellar because at any moment bombs can happen. And he's reading these really intimate, very personal human accounts of war. And I think everyone can connect with that kind of private, quiet moment in a root cellar, but knowing about the potential for destruction at any point. It reminded me of Ilya Kaminsky, who is a Ukrainian-American poet. And I was able to hear Ilya and other Ukrainian poets immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And they were reading from their own root cellars. They were reading from their apartments. They were reading from basements where they were taking cover in bomb shelters. They were, of course, this was virtual. It was a big webinar that hundreds of people attended, and listened to them read and bear witness. And so the grandfather in Grandfather's story reminded me of all of these Ukrainian poets desperately trying to reclaim their identity from this Russian occupation, to bear witness to the humanity of their experience and their own dignity. So in a way, Grandfather's story, like you said, Dawn, is so relevant and compelling.
What do you think happens to the son, or what do you think the grandfather thinks happens to him? Because it sort of sends him off, into the future, I guess.
I think what the grandfather empowers the son with is his name, is his identity, is his home, is his culture, and his ability to then connect with others. He will carry that magic power of reading. That's what the grandfather taught him. And so he'll carry that connection forward in the hope of continuing this stitching together of humanity that is so threatened in times of war.
The other thing I know is somebody said that someone planted kudzu in New York City. I pondered this one. I read it a couple of times to consider what I should think of it. Tell us about the story, and it's sort of a bit lighthearted, I think.
Yes, Someone Planted Kudzu in New York City is by Sam Campbell. This is a brilliant story that reads kind of like a moving visual canvas. Green flows of kudzu creep up walls, down sidewalks, cover buildings in this explosion of defiant life in the city. In the end, what the reader comes to understand is that this kudzu could be considered a metaphor for the character's writing process. And a lot of the works of literature in this collection also speak either directly or obliquely to the challenges of creative expression. The challenges of, again, it's bearing witness, it's putting oneself out there. So the spilling of words on the page, when the main character is finally free to write, it's kind of like the spilling of green kudzu in the city. The story plays with the idea of poetic inspiration, but here we have the juxtaposition that it can also be invasive. It can grip you. You can kind of push it aside. It's going to come back. And what comes out of that is fascinating. It speaks to the juxtapositions you were talking about earlier. But if possible, I'd like to read a very brief section from the beginning and the end so you feel that metaphor. No one knows when it was planted, or who did it, or why. In fact, no one even noticed at first. It was a gradual realization, like when you slowly understand that growing up wasn't anything like you thought it would be, or when you allow days to become weeks and then months without speaking to your parents back home, or when you lie down to sleep next to someone every night, and without even meaning to, you find yourself falling out of love with them. That's how the kudzu managed to grow in the middle of the city, by being quiet and steady and invisible. It slithered inch by inch in the background, taking Balto and then the Bethesda fountain. When it began to walk with me down the mall and climb into the stone laps of the authors I prayed to, I noticed. I would stand and stare at it, its broad green leaves fluttering in the wind, and the tiny curled fingers reaching out toward the wide open spaces, just hoping for something to cling to. And then at the end of the story, here's the paragraph we find. I lost myself in the story, became memorized with the transfer of words from brain to hand to page, became hypnotized by the light scratching sound of the pen against paper, became entranced at the sight of ink pouring out into swirling, twirling, winding letters, linking to form words, to form sentences, to form paragraphs, to form pages, and everything connects and is interconnected, and I quit.
I want to turn to something also a bit on the light side. The Bug Girls, which again is some flash nonfiction, I guess it is. And Wilson, you said that you were sort of enamored with this particular story.
Yes, this is our featured story, actually, by Steph Libertor, who's a teacher at a college professor of writing. And it starts off as, it seems like a very simple 1,000-word piece. And like so many, it has different levels. The author was actually with her daughter, was present with the 17-year cicada invasion, and her daughter is looking at the cicadas and is amazed, and she's looking at them and is totally repulsed. So the two different visions, if you will, of the looking and experiencing the cicadas is the framework for this brief piece. But what it is a back and forth between the mother and daughter, showing the differences in how we look at things between generations, between sexes, between people, and it's that's why it's a fascinating piece.
Mm. And finally, Hal, I want to turn to you because we had a lot of stories about deaths, about trying to move on, that kind of thing. But one of the things that struck me was a story that was written called "When I First Met You," and one of the sentences that struck me was, "What we feel and what we remember, whether it is real, is what shapes us." Tell us a little bit about that thought and the fact that it really sort of pervades how we perceive death and those who we've lost. Lee?
Well, just when I hear that and when I read that again, I go back to this gift that these writers afford us, which is how to pay attention to our worlds. And I keep going back to that. Ilya Kaminsky said it, and I think there's strength in there because these writings allow us perspectives insight again into our own selves, into our own lives that we couldn't articulate before or couldn't even perceive.
Okay, and I want to talk to poetry. And in your interview, by the way, with Devin Miller Duggan, he talks about discovering, ideas that he sort of stuck his hand in a bag of letters and pulled one out, right? As sort of this way to sort of spontaneously create these ideas, these concepts. Tell me a little bit about what you learned.
Well, it's funny. I have known Devin for a long time. She's a very good friend of mine, and I've been reading her poems probably for 25 years. But I'm always amazed in talking to a poet about the way that they compose poems, how much goes into, how much of their lives, how much of their thought, how much of their feeling goes into any poem. And so I thought that the interview that we have in here is obviously shorter, in here meaning in this issue, is shorter than the interview that is recorded on the website. And it was hard to distill it down because there was so much that we said. We went a little bit over, actually.
As we always do, right?
Yes, we always do.
And one of the things is one of those poems is in order to pray for history after it happens or after. Tell me about that.
I think my partner in crime, our other poetry editor, Catherine Gecker, in the interview, she talks about this poem as being one of her very favorite of Devin's poems. And I think that the part that, I don't know if you want me to read the whole thing, but the part that she pulls out is this beautiful sound of this poem. And I'll just read the beginning. In order to pray for history as it happens or after, you must pray for those prayers, researching them laboriously. Paper, papyrus, parchment, stone, voices, with footnotes and appendices. You need too many languages, too many tongues speaking, clicking, tisking, curling, and uncurling while burning like an angel's skin. And those are just the first two stanzas of the poem, but I think you can hear there the beautiful sounds, the beautiful language, the alliteration of paper, papyrus, parchment, right? And all of the ways that Devin is using sound to push language toward its edge. The quote that I thought of when Wilson asked me to characterize the poems in this edition actually came to me when I was watching Maestro. And I don't know if any of you guys have had a chance to see Maestro yet. It's a beautiful film about Leonard Bernstein, but there's a Leonard Bernstein quote right in the beginning of the film that says, "A work of art does not answer questions, it provokes them. And its essential meaning is in the tension between the contradictory answers." And I think that all of Devin's poems do that, but I think you could almost pick any poem in the issue and find that it's not answering a question. There's no easy, click, shut, this is what we should all do, thank you very much, goodbye. It's always all of the different questions playing against each other that might someday bring us to something like an answer.
One of the other things I mentioned a moment ago is that lots of poems and stories about grieving and about death. The couple that popped in my mind, I was K.Elma Peterson. One is whereabout of one who ceases to be, and in the line it says, "I see his face no longer aging like my own. I hear his words, a stir of air, my recognition." And then in Tumor, it reads, "Neither one of us ready yet to say out loud that it feels like the end is taking longer than we thought it would." I mean, there's this process, I think, that you get in a number of different poems that you have on this.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true, because one of the things that we always have questions about, right? All of the different questions, We don't tend to have lots and lots of questions about joy. We don't. Not that there are no joyful poems. There are joyful poems, but we usually come by that joy. I'm thinking of a Khalil Gibran quote all of a sudden, right? The deeper that sorrow carves our cup, the more of joy it can hold. And so, a lot of the poems are definitely about how do you deal with loss. And about holding open the question of loss, not trying to close it down, not consoling it immediately, but allowing the loss to live. And I think that's what Hal was saying too, just allowing loss and sitting with loss.
The other one, by the way, that struck me, and it's the one about the ghost blankets. And
Yes.
that image that you have. Read a bit of it.
Okay, I will definitely read a little bit of that, Ghost Blankets. And that's also Kayama Peterson, right?
I believe so. And because it struck me, the imagery that I saw was really quite remarkable. And as we look for it, because I had not thought about the idea that we have these people who are laying there, they're homeless, and they're sleeping overnight, and then suddenly they sort of awaken, as it were, but that we tend to pass them by as we go about our daily lives.
Yes. I'm just having a moment trying to find Ghost Blankets. Oh, there it is.
Go ahead.
Susan Bucci Mockler. And let me just read Ghost Blankets. Scattered around the city, in alleys, on street corners, billowing over grates. Blankets, miscellaneous cover-ups outlining bodies. Gray, bleak, ashy, cotton, fleece, wool, wet with dew or overnight rain. Thin throws, ironic comforters. Come morning, a metamorphosis. A body appears, a hunger arises, a ghost no longer. Words cascading into the frosty air. I'm here. See me. Why is my language so difficult to understand? That's that last bit is in italics, and I think what we're hearing is the voice of those homeless people who are unhoused people who are coming to life in the morning, coming out from under those blankets.
It's quite a striking image when we think about, because we don't really think about that, and then all of a sudden there's this image of people who've been sleeping, and then suddenly they come to life.
Yes.
We don't think of it that way.
No. And I think that it's a beautiful visual image as well as beautiful oral imagery.
Well, speaking of beautiful images, we got this poem called The Pond at Evening. I wanted to read it because I think we all said is very Eastern Shore.
Very Eastern Shore.
To say the least. I can hear the herons now, We'll go ahead and read that for us.
Let me just say that because we're the Delmarva Review, we get a lot of poems about herons.
I can't imagine why.
And I think, that not all, this is an exceptional poem about herons. And one of the reasons I think it's exceptional is because of its beautiful visual imagery, but also because it's doing something so interesting with the image. It's not just allowing it to stand there. It's saying something about the way time works, and the way memory works, and the way things get erased. So this is Madeline Cohen Oakley's poem, The Pond at Evening. Still light after sundown, not yet dusk or dark. The great blue heron appears among the reeds, spare, silent, elegant. The barred owl calls, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you?" Some days, his call is answered. Colors begin to fade. The edges of the pond begin to blur. The heron, watered silk, recedes into the reeds. Only the small white egret is still visible against the light that is leaving. That's
Typically,
beautiful. Yeah,
Eastern Shore.
Yes, but also I think not just leaving us a heron, but leaving us with with a big question. and a question about hope and love and loss and all of those essential human things.
Finally, I want to turn to George Merrill, who I worked with for about 10 years, broadcast his essays on our stations. I got to know him as a colleague and a friend who, every few weeks, he'd come by to record his essays. And, of course, invariably, we'd go to his favorite Italian restaurant. I think that was the highlight of his day. And in your review of the book section, there is, of course, entitled Living into Darkness and Finding a Light, Spiritual Reflections on Life's Final Chapter, with Merrill and his wife, Jo. Tell me then a little bit about that collection, and we haven't really had time to reflect on him and his passing.
Well, he was a good friend of ours as well. So I think when you mention his name, almost anywhere in the Eastern Shore, Baltimore, what have you, it's amazing how many people know George, and he's had an impact on a lot of lives. His wife, Jo, illustrated the book, which was interesting. I mean, she took all of the published pieces essays that he had written over the last several years, and so they're all reproduced. And then she did an illustration for each one. She's a fine artist. So the book is by both of them, and it's George we published his last piece in the Delmarva Review, and almost any piece that he had, made people think about something in their lives. You couldn't just, read something and think you were getting by. He made you think deeply about your life and your contribution to mankind. It's quite good. So he had been the nonfiction editor for the Delmarva Review for several years, almost going back to the beginning. And he was certainly, to me, a mentor on starting the review, so that we felt the need to provide yet another avenue for good writing that came from not only this area but everywhere, and so he made quite a contribution.
One of the things that struck me about his writings, particular number of his essays, was that he seemed to find meaning in even the smallest of things. I mean, he could walk out in his backyard and see things, and I just passed by, I'm sure, but he seemed to find something more.
I couldn't agree more. And it just, he would see a waterman lifting a set of tongs with an oyster, and all of a sudden he'll make you start feeling about your life like you've never thought before. He had a wonderful inspiration about that. One of the things that was very difficult for George, however, we were in a writing group together, and it was the death of his father. He didn't talk about the death of his father much. So the last piece, he called me up and he said, I want to give you a story submit a story to the Delmarva Review, and it's about the death of my father. I knew how significant that was to him because he never mentioned it. He never wanted to talk about it. But he did, and just like everything else, it made you think about so many other things in your life. It was an amazing piece. So,
as a matter of fact, I think you quote a couple of things from his essays, and one of them is an essay about the blood transfusion. In his words, assuming a mystical awareness, a peculiarly transcendent moment, that even this very mundane thing that we take for granted, right, the technology and so on and so forth, which we're all sort of in awe of, but he seems to turn it into something that's greater than just itself.
That's George.
That was George, all right. We also have, obviously, the Talbot County High School Mentorship and Scholarship award winner. Tell us a little bit about that particular student.
This is a collaboration that we have with the Talbot County Public School System and with the Talbot County Arts Commission called Talbot Arts. And what we decided to do was to, it's not just adults that can write. We learn to write. We learn to write before we get into high school. We learn to write. And if you haven't learned how your spelling and your grammar by then, you're in trouble because you're not going to hear it anywhere else. And so the collaboration started, and we 2 years ago, and we select one writer out in a competition in high school. And the competition is generally in the junior year. It's someone who's going to be either a junior or a senior in high school. And that person is selected through this competitive process and works with our managing editor on a collaborative basis to rework the story that they're writing for publication in the Delmarva Review. That is an exceeding honor for any high school student to be asked to write for a national literary journal. I just can't tell you what that means. It happened to me once in high school, and it affected me the rest of my life. And I think it will for this winner. The winner this year is Mia Mazzeo. And she is a junior now at Easton High School. She's from St. Michael's, Maryland. And her piece is about experiencing divorce, living in a family where her parents were divorced. And it's really interesting. What she did was she describes how divorce affected her by the fact that she never knew her father much because he was off working all the time. And when the divorce occurred, and she was really quite taken and upset. And it gives you a view of how a young person is affected by divorce. And but she talks about all of a sudden getting to know her father by on the weekends, he would take her to the movie, and they would eat popcorn. And then after it was over, they would share talking about the movie. And she not only learned a lot about movies, but she got to know her father very well. And it's a well done flash nonfiction piece that again requires a lot of talent to be able to condense so much in a short piece. So she's the winner. She won. She not only worked for about 6 months with our managing editor on this piece, but which is an unusual experience for a high school student, but also got a monetary award, a scholarship, and she's now a junior, and she's a fine writer. We look forward to the next one.
Wish her the best. We've been speaking with the executive editor, Wilson Wyatt, also poetry editor, Ann Caldwell, senior fictional editor, Harold Wilson, and fictional co-editor, Lee Slater. And, of course, it is the Delmarva Review, which is out, 16th edition. Appreciate you all stopping by and chatting with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
This is Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.